Rain poured over downtown Chicago like the city itself was grieving. Yellow lights reflected across the wet streets while exhausted people rushed beneath umbrellas, trying to escape the cold wind slicing through the night. Outside the grand entrance of the luxurious The Grand Meridian Hotel, a long black limousine pulled away from the curb. Standing beside the entrance was Edward Sinclair, the billionaire owner of the hotel chain. His grey overcoat looked perfect. His polished shoes never touched a puddle. Even the doormen straightened their backs when he walked past. Edward believed one thing more than anything else in the world. Poor people stayed poor because they lacked discipline. And tonight he was about to prove it to himself again. Across the street, an old yellow taxi slowed near the hotel entrance. The driver, Marcus Reed, leaned forward over the steering wheel, squinting through the rain. Marcus looked exhausted. His jacket sleeve was torn near the wrist. His beard had grown uneven over the past week. Dark circles hung beneath his eyes like bruises from life itself. Inside the back seat sat an elderly woman wrapped in a thin sweater. "You sure this is the place?" Marcus asked gently. The woman nodded nervously. "My son works here. He told me to wait in the lobby until his shift ends." Marcus smiled softly. "Then let's get you warm." He stepped out into the rain immediately, not even caring that water soaked through his shoes. He opened the taxi door carefully and helped the woman out. At that exact moment, Edward Sinclair exited the hotel. His eyes narrowed instantly. The old taxi was parked directly beneath the luxury entrance canopy reserved for VIP guests. Edward's face hardened. "Move this cab immediately," he snapped at one of the doormen. Marcus turned politely. "Sir, the lady can barely walk. I'll only take a second." Edward looked Marcus up and down with visible disgust. "You people always have an excuse." The elderly woman lowered her eyes in embarrassment. Marcus inhaled slowly. "I'm sorry if we caused trouble." But Edward wasn't listening anymore. Two wealthy investors were approaching the entrance, and Edward hated anything that damaged the image of perfection surrounding his hotel. "Do you know how much money people pay to stay here?" Edward said coldly. "And you parked this rust bucket in front of my entrance?" Marcus stared quietly for a second. Rainwater dripped from his forehead. Then he calmly reached into his pocket and handed the valet $10. "For the inconvenience," he said. One of the investors laughed quietly. Edward's jaw tightened. $10. To a billionaire like him, it felt insulting. "You think charity fixes stupidity?" Edward said sharply. The entire entrance fell silent. The elderly woman whispered, "Please, don't argue because of me." Marcus looked at her kindly. "It's alright." But something in Edward suddenly snapped. Maybe it was the exhausting business meetings. Maybe it was the pressure from investors. Or maybe deep down, he simply enjoyed reminding people of their place. "You taxi drivers are all the same," Edward said loudly. "Late on payments, late on responsibility, always begging for sympathy." Marcus froze. The valet staff exchanged uncomfortable glances. "You don't know me," Marcus replied quietly. Edward stepped closer. "I know enough. Men like you waste their lives and expect respect anyway." Oof. That one hit hard. Even the investors stopped smiling. Marcus swallowed slowly, trying to stay calm. But his eyes carried pain deeper than anger. The kind of pain someone carries after life punches them repeatedly without mercy. Still, he stayed respectful. "I hope your night gets better, sir." Edward almost laughed. But before he could answer, the elderly woman suddenly collapsed. "Oh God!" Someone shouted. Marcus moved first. He dropped to his knees on the wet pavement, supporting her head carefully. Ma'am, can you hear me?" People panicked near the entrance. Edward stepped backward instinctively, not wanting chaos near his guests. Marcus immediately removed his jacket and placed it beneath the woman's head, despite the freezing rain soaking him completely. "Call an ambulance," he yelled. One of the employees hesitated and looked toward Edward first. Edward gave a small, annoyed nod. Only then did the employee make the call. Marcus checked the woman's pulse with trembling fingers. "Stay with me," he whispered desperately. The old woman weakly opened her eyes. "My medicine," she whispered. Marcus searched her purse carefully until he found a small bottle. He helped her take the pill while kneeling in freezing water. Minutes later, the ambulance arrived. Paramedics rushed toward them. "You family?" one asked Marcus. Marcus shook his head. "No, just her driver." The paramedic blinked in surprise. Because nobody did this anymore. Nobody stayed. Nobody cared this much. As the ambulance doors closed, the elderly woman grabbed Marcus's hand weakly. "You're a good man." Marcus smiled tiredly. Then the ambulance disappeared into the rainy night. For a moment, silence covered the hotel entrance. Edward adjusted his coat awkwardly. One investor finally spoke. That driver handled that pretty well. Edward forced a dry laugh. Emotion doesn't build success. Marcus heard him, and this time something changed in his eyes. Not anger, disappointment, the kind that cuts deeper than rage. He slowly picked up his soap jacket and turned toward his taxi, but before entering, he looked back once. "You're right, sir," Marcus said softly. "Money builds hotels." He paused. "Character builds human beings." Oof, even the wind seemed to stop moving. Edward's expression darkened instantly. "You're done here," he snapped. "This hotel contracts dozens of airport taxis. I'll personally make sure your license is blacklisted from every luxury property in this city." The valet staff stared in shock. Marcus said nothing. His tired eyes simply lowered toward the wet pavement. Because poor men learn early that fighting powerful people often costs more than silence. He entered the taxi slowly. The engine struggled twice before starting. Then the old yellow cab disappeared into the storm. But inside Edward Sinclair's luxury hotel, something far more dangerous had already begun. One investor quietly looked toward Edward and said, "You may have just fired the wrong man." And by sunrise, Edward Sinclair would discover who Marcus Reed really was. By midnight, the storm had swallowed most of Chicago. Inside the glowing marble lobby of the Grand Meridian Hotel, jazz music floated softly through hidden speakers, while wealthy guests laughed beside crystal chandeliers. But Edward Sinclair wasn't laughing anymore. He stood near the tall windows of his private office overlooking the city skyline, replaying the taxi driver's final words again and again. "Character builds human beings." The sentence irritated him far more than it should have. He loosened his tie aggressively and poured himself another glass of expensive whiskey. "How dramatic," he muttered. Still, something about Marcus Reed's eyes bothered him. Not fear, not desperation. Edward had seen those emotions thousands of times from employees, struggling businessmen, and people asking him for favors. No, Marcus had looked at him with pity, and Edward hated that feeling. Knock, knock. His assistant Claire entered carefully holding a tablet. "You still here?" Edward asked. "You asked me to investigate the taxi driver." Edward turned slowly. "And?" Claire hesitated. "Well, his name is Marcus Reed, 52 years old, clean driving record, no complaints. Actually," she looked down at the screen again, "passengers rate him unusually high." Edward scoffed. "Congratulations to him." But Claire didn't smile. "There's more." Edward leaned against the desk impatiently, then spit it out. Claire inhaled carefully. 3 years ago, Marcus owned a small construction company. Edward blinked once. "What?" "He employed 32 workers before the company collapsed during the recession." Edward frowned slightly. That wasn't the profile he expected. Claire continued. "According to records, he sold his house afterward to pay employee salaries before declaring bankruptcy." For a brief second, silence filled the office. Even the rain outside seemed quieter. Edward took another sip of whiskey. "So he failed," he said coldly. "Lots of people fail." "Yes," Claire replied softly, "but most don't bankrupt themselves protecting employees." Edward waved his hand dismissively. "People romanticize sacrifice because they're weak." Claire lowered the tablet slowly. "You really believe that?" Edward looked at her sharply. "You questioning me now?" "No, sir." But her voice lacked conviction. Before Edward could respond, his office phone rang. He answered immediately. "Yes?" His face changed within seconds. "What do you mean the investors left?" Claire watched him carefully. Edward's jaw tightened harder with every sentence. "They canceled tomorrow's partnership meeting?" Another pause. "Then, they said what?" Edward slowly lowered the phone. His expression had turned ice cold. Claire frowned. "What happened?" Edward slammed the receiver onto the desk. "The investors think I handled the situation outside poorly." Claire stayed silent. Edward laughed bitterly. Unbelievable. A billionaire gets judged over a taxi driver. But deep down, even he knew it wasn't about the taxi. It was about humanity. And for the first time in years, people had noticed his lack of it. Meanwhile, across the city, Marcus Reed parked his taxi outside a tiny apartment building with flickering hallway lights. The building looked exhausted. Cracked paint, broken railings, leaking gutters. Marcus climbed the stairs slowly, his knees aching from 14 straight hours of driving. As soon as he opened the apartment door, a little girl came running. "Grandpa!" "Oh!" Marcus instantly smiled despite his exhaustion. "There's my sunshine." 8-year-old Lily wrapped her arms around him tightly while giggling. "You're freezing," she laughed. "Ha ha ha, Chicago weather's trying to kill me." From the small kitchen, Marcus's daughter Elena looked up nervously. "You're late. Long night." She noticed the soaked clothes immediately. "What happened?" Marcus paused for a second before forcing a small smile. "Nothing important." But Elena knew that tone. Ever since her husband died in the military, Marcus had been the one holding the family together, driving endless shifts, skipping meals sometimes, pretending everything was fine even when life crushed him. Lily pulled Marcus toward the table excitedly. "I saved you noodles." Marcus placed a hand dramatically over his chest. "Well, now I know true luxury." Lily burst into laughter. Tiny apartment, cheap noodles, bills stacked on the counter, and somehow more warmth than Edward Sinclair's entire hotel. Marcus sat carefully while Elena watched him. "You look upset," she said quietly. Marcus sighed. "Some people have money so long they forget how to see human beings." Elena frowned. "Another rude passenger?" Marcus shook his head slowly. "Hotel owner." "Bad?" Marcus gave a tired laugh. He practically declared war on taxi drivers. Lily tilted her head innocently. "Why?" Marcus looked at his granddaughter for a moment. "Because children still ask simple questions adults stopped asking years ago. Sometimes," he said softly, "people become so rich they think kindness makes them smaller." Elena's eyes watered slightly. She hated hearing the exhaustion in his voice. "You should rest tomorrow." Marcus immediately shook his head. "Rent's due Friday." "But your health?" "I'm fine." Except he wasn't. His hands trembled slightly while lifting the fork. Weeks of stress were eating him alive. Yet he still smiled for Lily, still joked, still carried everyone else's pain quietly. Hours later, after Lily fell asleep on the couch beside cartoons still playing softly, Marcus covered her with a blanket. Then his phone buzzed. "Unknown number." Marcus answered cautiously. "Hello?" A nervous male voice replied. "Mr. Reed, this is Daniel from the Grand Meridian Valet staff." Marcus frowned slightly. "Yes?" The young man lowered his voice. "I thought you should know something." Marcus listened carefully, and with every sentence, his face slowly changed. The hotel owner hadn't just threatened him. Edward Sinclair had already contacted multiple luxury hotels across the city. Marcus was being blacklisted. His airport contracts would disappear by morning, which meant no contracts, no income, no apartment, no medicine for Elena, no school supplies for Lily, nothing. After the call ended, Marcus sat silently in the dark apartment. The television flickered softly across the room. Rain tapped against the windows, and for the first time in years, tears quietly rolled down his face, not because he was weak, but because he was tired, so unbelievably tired. Meanwhile, 40 floors above Chicago, Edward Sinclair stood in his penthouse, staring down at the city proudly. He believed he had won. He believed power protected him. He believed poor people simply disappeared when pushed hard enough. But far below, fate was already moving pieces he could not see. Because the old woman from the ambulance, she hadn't forgotten Marcus Reed. And by tomorrow afternoon, one phone call was about to change everything. Edward Sinclair thought he destroyed a taxi driver's future. But he had no idea whose life Marcus Reed had just saved. Morning sunlight spilled across Chicago, but Marcus Reed barely noticed it. He sat quietly inside his old yellow taxi near a gas station, staring at his phone screen while rejection emails continued arriving, one after another. Airport contract terminated, luxury pickup privileges suspended, service access denied. Oof. Every message felt like another brick crushing his chest. Marcus leaned back slowly and closed his eyes. 20 years of honest work, gone overnight. Nearby, impatient horns echoed through traffic while people rushed toward jobs, meetings, and expensive coffee shops. The city kept moving like nothing happened. But Marcus's world had stopped. His phone rang again. Another unknown number. He almost ignored it. Almost. "Hello?" A calm woman's voice answered. "Mr. Reed?" "Yes, my name is Margaret Whitmore." Marcus frowned slightly. "I'm sorry, who?" "The woman from last night." Marcus sat upright immediately. "The elderly passenger." "You feeling all right?" he asked quickly. A soft chuckle came through the phone. "Ha ha ha, thanks to you, yes." Relief washed over Marcus instantly. "That's good to hear." Margaret paused for a moment. "Can we meet today?" Marcus hesitated. Normally he'd refuse politely. He had bills to chase, problems to solve, survival to figure out. But something in her voice felt sincere. "Sure," he replied quietly. "Wonderful. Come to the Whitmore Foundation building at noon." Marcus nearly dropped the phone. The Whitmore Foundation? Everybody in Chicago knew that name. One of the largest charity organizations in the state. Hospitals, scholarships, homeless shelters, veterans programs. Huge, very huge. You sure you got the right driver? Marcus asked awkwardly. Margaret laughed warmly again. Oh, I'm very sure. The call ended. Marcus stared ahead silently, then looked down at his wrinkled shirt. Ha ha ha, well this should be interesting. Meanwhile, across town inside the Grand Meridian Hotel, Edward Sinclair was having the worst morning of his year. Cancelled? He slammed a file onto the conference table. His executive team sat frozen. Another investor had backed away from negotiations after hearing about the incident outside the hotel. Social media posts from witnesses had already begun spreading online. A wealthy hotel owner humiliating a taxi driver during a storm? People hated stories like that, especially when the driver helped save an elderly woman moments later. Edward rubbed his forehead furiously. This is ridiculous. One executive spoke carefully. Sir, public perception matters. Edward snapped instantly. I built this company from nothing. Silence. Then Claire spoke softly from across the room. And maybe that's why people expected more from you. Oof. Edward glared at her. But before he could respond, his assistant rushed into the room nervously. Sir, you have an urgent call. From who? The assistant swallowed hard. The Whitmore Foundation. The room went silent immediately. Even Edward's expression shifted slightly. Everyone knew the Whitmores. Old money, massive influence, powerful connections across politics, business, and media. Edward straightened his jacket before taking the call. This is Edward Sinclair. A calm male voice answered. Mr. Sinclair, this is James Whitmore. Edward's tone instantly softened. Mr. Whitmore, what an honor. No need for formalities, James replied coldly. I'm calling about the man you blacklisted. Edward froze slightly. Ah, so this was about the taxi driver. I believe there's been a misunderstanding, Edward said smoothly. No, James replied. I think the misunderstanding is yours. The conference room became painfully quiet. James continued. The woman your staff ignored last night was my mother. Edward's stomach tightened. And the man who helped save her life was Marcus Reed. Edward opened his mouth carefully. Well, you publicly humiliated him. Edward's face slowly lost color, and then used your influence to threaten his livelihood. Nobody in the room moved. Nobody even breathed loudly. James Whitmore's voice turned sharper now. My mother spent all night talking about that driver, about his kindness, about how nobody else moved except him. Edward tried recovering. I'm sure emotions intensified the situation. No, Mr. Sinclair. Character revealed the situation. Oof, that one landed hard. James continued calmly. You know something ironic? Edward stayed silent. Marcus Reed once donated construction materials to one of our homeless housing projects years ago. Edward blinked. What? Yes, quietly, without cameras, without publicity. Claire slowly looked down at the table. James exhaled softly. My mother asked me one question this morning. Edward swallowed. She asked how a man with so little could show more humanity than a man who owns luxury hotels. Silence crushed the room. Then came the final blow. The Whitmore Foundation is officially withdrawing from all future partnerships with the Grand Meridian. Edward's eyes widened. That partnership was worth millions, maybe more. And one more thing, James added. We're holding our annual charity gala next month. Edward tried speaking quickly. We'd still be honored to host. You won't be hosting anything. Click. The line disconnected. Edward slowly lowered the phone. Nobody spoke. Nobody dared. Because everyone in that room knew exactly what had happened. The billionaire had just been publicly abandoned by one of the most influential families in Chicago. Over a taxi driver. Meanwhile, Marcus stood nervously inside the enormous marble lobby of the Whitmore Foundation. Everything looked expensive. Polished floors, massive artwork, employees in elegant suits. Marcus suddenly became painfully aware of his worn shoes. A receptionist smiled warmly. Mr. Reed, Miss Whitmore is waiting for you. Minutes later, Marcus entered a private office overlooking the river. Margaret Whitmore sat beside the window with a blanket across her lap. The moment she saw him, her eyes softened. There's my hero. Marcus immediately laughed awkwardly. Ha ha ha, please don't call me that. But it's true. He sat carefully across from her. You feeling stronger today? Much. She studied him quietly for a moment. You look tired. Marcus smiled faintly. Long week. Margaret already knew. James had investigated everything after hearing what happened. The bankruptcy, the daughter, the granddaughter, the blacklisting, everything. And honestly, it broke her heart. You know, Margaret said softly, most people with power show their true selves when they meet someone who has none. Marcus looked down silently. I didn't come here for pity. I know. She reached for a folder beside her chair. And that's exactly why you deserve help. Marcus frowned slightly. What is this? Open it. He did carefully, then froze. Inside were legal documents, business licenses, property records. Marcus stared in disbelief. I don't understand. Margaret smiled gently. My son owns a transportation company. Marcus looked up slowly. And after hearing your story, her smile widened. We think it deserves a new owner. Marcus's eyes instantly filled with tears, real tears. The kind a man tries hiding after life hurts him too many times. No, I can't. Yes, you can. His hands trembled. Why would you do this for me? Margaret leaned back softly. Because kindness should never go bankrupt. Ugh. At that exact same moment across the city, Edward Sinclair received another devastating phone call. 3 major investors were pulling out. Stock prices were beginning to drop. And suddenly, for the first time in his powerful life, Edward felt fear. Real fear. Because money could buy luxury, but it could not buy respect once people stopped believing in you. And before the week ended, Edward Sinclair would come face to face with the one person he never expected to need, Marcus Reed. Chicago had seen powerful men rise before, and it had seen them fall, but nobody expected Edward Sinclair's downfall to happen this fast. Within days, headlines spread across local business media. Luxury hotel CEO faces backlash after viral incident. Whitmore Foundation ends partnership with Grand Meridian. Investors question leadership at Sinclair Hotels. Inside the towering offices of the Grand Meridian Hotel, panic had replaced confidence. Executives whispered nervously in hallways. Phones rang non-stop. Employees avoided eye contact whenever Edward passed by. And for the first time in years, nobody rushed to agree with him anymore. Because power only feels permanent until fear disappears. Edward stood alone inside his office staring at the city skyline. The same skyline he once believed belonged to him. But now, it felt cold, distant, untouchable. Knock, knock. Claire entered carefully holding another report. Edward didn't even turn around. How bad? Claire hesitated. We lost another investor this morning. Edward closed his eyes slowly. And the gala? The Whitmore Foundation officially announced a new venue. Oof. That gala had been one of the biggest social events of the year. Losing it wasn't just financial damage, it was humiliation. Claire stepped closer quietly. You should apologize. Edward laughed bitterly. To a taxi driver? To a human being. Silence. Edward wanted to argue, wanted to defend himself, wanted to blame social media, investors, bad timing, anything. But deep down, he remembered Marcus kneeling in freezing rain helping a stranger while everyone else hesitated, even him, especially him. And somehow that memory hurt more than the financial losses. Meanwhile, across the city, Marcus Reed's life was slowly changing. Not magically, not perfectly, but changing. The transportation company James Whitmore transferred to him wasn't enormous, but it was stable, honest work, real opportunity. For the first time in years, Marcus slept more than 4 hours. Elena smiled again. Bills stopped piling endlessly on the kitchen counter. And little Lily, she practically floated through the apartment with excitement. Grandpa's the boss now, she shouted one morning while dancing around the living room. Marcus burst into laughter. Hey, easy there. Bosses still pay taxes. Lily giggled loudly before jumping into his arms. That tiny apartment suddenly felt brighter, warmer, alive again. But Marcus never changed. That surprised everyone most. He still opened doors for elderly passengers. Still tipped struggling waitresses, still carried bottled water inside his taxi for homeless people during hot afternoons. Pain had not made him cruel, and that made him rare. One afternoon, Marcus arrived at a small community center funded by the Whitmore Foundation. James Whitmore greeted him warmly. You're becoming popular around here. Marcus shook his head quickly. No, I'm just trying to work. James smiled knowingly. That's exactly why people trust you. Inside the center, volunteers prepared meals for struggling families while children laughed nearby. Marcus quietly helped move supply boxes towards storage. No cameras, no interviews, no dramatic speeches, just kindness. Margaret Whitmore watched from nearby with emotional eyes. "You were right about him," she whispered to her son. James nodded softly. "He's the kind of man money can't create." At that exact moment across town, Edward Sinclair sat alone in a nearly empty restaurant. Not long ago, people begged for invitations to dine with him. Now, several executives had quietly cancelled meetings. His phone remained silent. Funny how success attracts crowds, but failure reveals loneliness. The waitress approached nervously with the bill. Edward reached for his wallet automatically, then paused. He had forgotten it in his office. Embarrassing silence followed. I'm sorry," he muttered awkwardly. "I must have left my wallet." The young waitress looked uncomfortable. "It's alright, sir, but my manager, I'll come back and pay." Before she could answer, another voice spoke behind him. "It's covered." Edward turned slowly and froze. Marcus Reed stood there holding 2 coffee cups. For a second, neither man spoke. The universe suddenly felt very small. The waitress smiled gratefully and walked away. Edward stared at Marcus in disbelief. "You paid for me?" Marcus handed him 1 coffee calmly. "You looked like you needed it." Oof, that hurt more than any insult ever could. Edward looked down at the table quietly. "I don't deserve your kindness." Marcus sat across from him slowly. "Maybe not." The honesty stunned Edward, but kindness isn't supposed to depend on deserving. Silence filled the restaurant. Heavy silence. The kind that forces a man to hear his own conscience. Edward rubbed his hands together slowly. "I was cruel to you. Yes. I judged you. Yes. I tried to ruin your life." Marcus looked at him carefully now. "And yet, here you are." Edward's eyes watered slightly for the first time in years. Not dramatic crying, just quiet regret leaking through cracks in his pride. "I spent my whole life believing money proved value," he admitted softly. Marcus nodded once. "A lot of people do." Edward laughed bitterly. "But when everything started collapsing, none of those rich people stayed." Marcus sipped his coffee quietly, then smiled faintly. Because respect and fear looked similar from far away. Oof. Edward lowered his head. "I don't know how to fix what I became." Marcus looked out the restaurant window toward the busy Chicago streets. "You start small." Edward listened carefully. "You listen more." Pause. "You help people who can't repay you." Another pause. "And maybe someday you become someone your younger self would actually admire." The words hit Edward harder than losing millions ever did. Because deep down, he remembered being young once, hungry once, human once. Hours later, the 2 men stepped outside into the evening air. Snowflakes drifted softly across the city now, replacing the storm from the night they first met. Funny how life worked. Edward extended his hand slowly. Marcus looked at it for a second before shaking it. Not because the billionaire deserved forgiveness, but because Marcus refused to let bitterness poison his own heart. And honestly, that was the real victory. Months later, the Grand Meridian launched new community programs for struggling workers and local drivers, quietly, without giant press conferences. Edward personally funded scholarships for transportation workers' children, and every Christmas, anonymously, yellow taxis across Chicago received envelopes covering winter expenses. Marcus always knew who sent them, but he never mentioned it, because sometimes the strongest lessons don't arrive through revenge. Sometimes they arrive through mercy, and long after Chicago forgot the scandal, people still remembered one thing. A wealthy hotel owner once tried destroying a taxi driver, but in the end, the taxi driver saved the wealthy man instead. Moral of the story is, true wealth is not measured by money, luxury, or status, but by how kindly you treat people when they can offer you nothing in return. A person with a humble heart can change lives more deeply than someone with great power but no compassion. Respect, kindness, and humanity will always leave a stronger legacy than pride or success alone. Please subscribe my channel, like, share my video. Bye guys.